Yeah, and I didn't work with Walter Lord so much as I interacted with him occasionally. I spoke to him on the phone, I met him at his home. He came to Titanic Historical Society conventions, and he was certainly a wonderful guy.
Well, it's recipe evidence, and we don't have any recipes from the Titanic, but we have recipes of things that we can assume were consumed aboard the Titanic, and many things that we know for sure from menus, letters home, and so forth.
It really highlights the importance of looking at the original documents, the primary sources, to get as close as you can to the detail as possible, and also that critical thinking. What evidence do we have available? What is it telling us? How do we interpret that information? What is the significance of it?
But, I love the stories and things. I think that's one of the best things about A Night to Remember is it really draws the reader in because you're able to see what happened through the eyes of people who are there.
Titanic's history, I suppose it's a million-piece jigsaw, and the majority of those pieces, in some cases, are missing.
Hello, and welcome to the Titanic Provenance Files. I'm Damon Henriks. You just heard three voices you'll be hearing more from this season. Historian Don Lynch, author Veronica Henke, and researcher Mark Churnside. They were talking about three very different things: a book, a cocktail, a lifeboat. But beneath each conversation is the same question. How do we know what we know? That question is the reason this podcast exists. Every episode begins with an object, a document, an artifact, a photograph, a piece of evidence. Together, we'll follow the trail those objects leave behind and the larger stories they reveal. History rarely hands us the complete picture. It hands us the pieces, and piece by piece, we'll put them together. Because sometimes the most interesting question isn't what happened, it's how we know what happened. And that brings us to our first case file. Case file 001, drawn to Titanic. Before we begin, I should probably tell you who I am and who I'm not. I'm not a museum curator. I'm not a professional archaeologist, and I don't claim to know everything there is to know about Titanic. What I am is someone who has spent more than 40 years fascinated by this remarkable ship. I do hold a degree in 20th century history from Northwestern University, which taught me something that has become increasingly important to me over the years. Good history isn't about knowing the answers. It's about asking where those answers came from. That's the journey I hope we'll take. And most importantly, we'll take it together. This episode was originally meant to be a sort of preview of the season ahead. That's why we began with three guests I've already had the privilege of interviewing: Don Lynch, Veronica Henke, Mark Churnside. The plan was to tell you what this show would be about, maybe play a few more clips, introduce you to some of the remarkable people you'll be meeting this season. But since this is Case File 001, I hope you'll indulge me for a moment. You don't know me yet, and that's almost exactly why I'd like to begin with my own Titanic story, so we can get to know each other a little as we begin this journey together. I had an object in mind for our first show object something a little silly, almost a prop, if you will. But as I started examining the object, I found myself examining my own Titanic story. Because today's object isn't a priceless artifact. It isn't tucked away in an archive. It actually is hanging on the wall behind me right now. It's a colored pencil drawing of RMS Titanic, and I made it when I was about 9 years old. At first, the explanation seems obvious. I drew Titanic because I was fascinated by Titanic. Except that answer isn't really good enough. The truth is, I can't remember becoming fascinated by Titanic. In fact, I can't remember not knowing about Titanic. By the time I was in elementary school, I was making Titanic diorama book reports. I'd read Walter Lord's A Night to Remember, and I had made this drawing. But here's the strange part. I don't actually remember reading A Night to Remember for the first time. In my memory, I'd somehow always read it. Of course, that isn't possible, which meant this drawing suddenly presented a question of its own. Or if this were a Senate hearing, it would be, what did Damon know and when did he know it? More importantly for our object, what convinced a 9-year-old boy to sit down with a handful of colored pencils and draw Titanic? And just like that, this little drawing wasn't a prop anymore. It had become evidence. Evidence with a provenance. And like every good provenance investigation, let's examine the object. Medium. Colored pencil on ordinary paper. Date. Sometime in the early 1980s. Condition. Slightly faded, still framed, a slight tear in the lower right extremity. Artist. Clearly a very enthusiastic little boy. Signature. Across the top in unmistakable elementary school handwriting. The words Titanic by Damon. The funnels lean a little unevenly. The perspective leaves room for improvement. The proportions are, let's call them, optimistic. And yet, I kept it. And now, more than 40 years later, it hangs proudly on my wall. Certainly not because it's beautiful or because it's valuable, but because it's important. Not important to Titanic, important to me. If this drawing showed up at an auction, no one would question whether it was authentic. It's clearly one of a kind. Although the auctioneer might question whether the artist had ever actually seen a ship. But provenance isn't always about monetary value. Sometimes it's about understanding why an object exists at all. This drawing tells us almost nothing about RMS Titanic. It won't answer any questions about the sinking. It won't settle historical debates. But it does tell us something. It tells us that somewhere, a little over 40 years ago, a little boy became captivated by a ship. And he decided he had to draw it. And that is the story we are investigating today in episode 001. Every provenance investigation begins with the same question. Where did this object come from? At first, that sounds like an easy question. I drew it. Case closed. Except that's not really the answer, because nobody wakes up one morning as a 9-year-old and decides, today I'm going to draw an ocean liner. something happened first. Something drew me to Titanic. And if we're going to understand this drawing, we have to follow its provenance, which means we have to go back to the beginning. Every provenance investigation begins with the same question. Where did this object come from? In this case, the answer is a little unusual. We know who created it. We know approximately when it was created. I even know where it ended up. It's here on the wall behind me. But the question I'm really interested in isn't who drew it. It's what caused it to be drawn in the first place. Now, that's a much harder question to answer. So, how do we trace the provenance of a childhood drawing? You start with what you know. I know I made this drawing when I was about 9 years old. I know that about the same time, I read Walter Lord's A Night to Remember, first published in 1955, nearly 25 years before I was born. I loved it. In fact, it was probably the first adult book I had ever read cover to cover. But that raises another question. What 9-year-old boy simply wakes up one morning and decides to read A Night to Remember? Something had to come first. Something had sparked that interest in me. So I began looking for the earliest clue I could find. A quick internet search revealed something I had not consciously remembered before beginning this investigation. The ABC movie S.O.S. Titanic premiered on September 23rd, 1979 at 9 o'clock Eastern, when I was 8 years old. Now, that doesn't prove it was the beginning, but it gave me a good place to start. I recently watched it again while preparing this episode. It's not exactly cinematic perfection, but one moment nudged my memory. Bruce Ismay staring down at deck chairs floating in the Atlantic. I don't remember much else about the movie. I probably slept through a good portion of it. At nearly 3 hours long, it ran way past my bedtime. Now, what I cannot prove is that this movie came first. I can't produce a diary entry that says, "Tonight I watched S.O.S. Titanic, and tomorrow I'm going to begin a lifelong fascination with Titanic." Kids don't usually leave that kind of paper trail. So, we do what historians often have to do. We gather clues, we compare them, we test them against one another, and we try to separate a reasonable conclusion from something we merely want to believe. Here's what that narrative looks like. A boy watches a television movie about Titanic. He starts asking questions. His mother encourages that curiosity by buying him Walter Lord's A Night to Remember. He reads it. He draws the ship. The fascination never entirely lets go. Can I prove every link in that chain? No. But every link is supported by something real. A broadcast date. A vague memory of a movie scene, Walter Lord's A Night to Remember, a childhood drawing, and 40 years of continued fascination. Honestly, that's how history usually works, not from one perfect piece of evidence, but several imperfect pieces that fit together. That's true whether you're investigating your own childhood or interviewing survivors of the Titanic disaster. For example, survivors remembered extraordinary things. The angle of the decks, the lights going out, the cries of hundreds of people in the water, the terrible sounds as the ship came apart. But they didn't always remember everything the same way. Some insisted Titanic sank in one piece. Others were absolutely convinced she broke in two. Now, if you'd asked 9-year-old Damon Henricks which version he wanted to believe, there wouldn't have been much debate. Of course I wanted her to have gone down in one piece. Not because the evidence pointed that way, but because I wanted it to be true. Point of fact, I'm one of the relatively few people who owns and has read Beyond Reach, The Search for Titanic. It's a book written by oil man Jack Grimm about his attempt to find Titanic. The book was published in 1982, 3 years before Robert Ballard discovered the Titanic in September of 1985. Reading it today is fascinating. Not because Grimm found Titanic, of course he didn't, but it preserves a moment when no one yet knew where Titanic lay, when the possibility of finding her felt very real. There was still room to dream. I even loved the movie Raise the Titanic. Now that's probably not something most Titanic researchers will admit with great pride. But I wasn't watching it because I believed it. I watched it because I desperately wanted it to be true. I wanted someone to find Titanic and complete her voyage to New York. Of course, history had other plans. Robert Ballard found Titanic, broken in two, about 350 miles southeast of Newfoundland. The wreck answered a question survivor testimony alone had never been able to settle. Looking back now, I realized something. This drawing wasn't the beginning of the story. It was evidence that the story had already begun. The drawing didn't create the fascination. The fascination created the drawing. And somewhere along the way, I stopped asking what happened and started asking, how do we know? Looking back, I think every Titanic enthusiast begins in the same place. We want to know what happened. How big was the iceberg? Why did Titanic only have 20 lifeboats when there were nearly 2,200 people on board? What really was the last song played on the Titanic by its band? Why didn't the Californian come to rescue Titanic? They're wonderful questions. In fact, they're the questions that drew most of us into the story. But if you stay with Titanic long enough, another question begins to emerge. Not what happened, but how do we know? That second question changes everything. Suddenly, you're not just reading another Titanic book. You're comparing it to the last one you read and all the ones before that. You notice that one author tells the story one way and another tells it differently. Jack Thayer never wavered in saying Titanic broke apart before she disappeared beneath the surface. Second Officer Charles Lightoller remained equally convinced that she sank intact. In fact, at the American Inquiry, when asked whether Titanic was broken or intact, replied, quote, absolutely intact, unquote. For decades, newspapers repeated the dramatic line, "Be British, boys, be British." Yet the line cannot be firmly traced to Captain Smith by any first-hand account of the sinking. So you begin to realize something. Every statement and every history book rests on something: a witness, a photograph, a letter, an artifact, evidence. And every piece of evidence has a provenance. Somewhere along the way, I stopped paying attention only to the answers. I became fascinated by the sources: footnotes in a book, inquiry testimony, letters, photographs, and the disagreements. Especially the disagreements, because disagreements force us to ask, why? That's when I realized something about the people in the Titanic community I admired most. Walter Lord wasn't simply telling Titanic's story. He was assembling it. Don Lynch does the same thing. Veronica Henke does the same thing. Mark Churnside does the same thing. The Titanic researchers I admire most all start in the same place: evidence. They don't begin with conclusion. That stacks the deck before the evidence is even heard. They begin with questions. Somewhere in all of that reading, all of that listening, all of those years, I realized there was a particular kind of Titanic conversation I wanted to hear more often. A conversation that began with an object. There are already many excellent Titanic podcasts exploring testimony, memory, and evidence, and I definitely recommend you seek them out. This podcast approaches that conversation from a different starting point. One that begins with an object, follows its provenance, and asks not only what we know, but how we know it. Because that's where the story opens up. That's why every episode of the Titanic Provenance Files begins with an object. Because the object isn't the destination, it's the doorway. A recipe isn't just about food. It's a doorway into everyday life aboard Titanic. A chronometer isn't really about a clock. It's a doorway into navigation, precision, and the people whose lives depended on it. A lump of coal isn't really about coal. It's a doorway into engineering, labor, industry, and even the conspiracy theories that still surround Titanic today. And this drawing was never really about art. It was the doorway that eventually led me here. And that's why this podcast exists. Every investigation reaches a point where the evidence stops and the story begins. This investigation reminded me that memory is evidence, but imperfect evidence. It showed me that even the smallest objects can leave surprisingly long trails. And perhaps most importantly, it reminded me that sometimes the object you begin with isn't the story at all. It's simply the thing that leads you to the story. This one began with a child's drawing. This drawing isn't important because of what it tells us about Titanic. It's important because of what it tells us about curiosity. A child's curiosity became a lifetime of reading. Reading became research. Research became questions. Questions became conversations. And eventually, those conversations became this podcast. More than 40 years ago, I sat down with a handful of colored pencils and drew Titanic. I had absolutely no idea that one day I'd be sitting behind a microphone, talking with historians, authors, researchers, museum curators, and people all over the world about the ship that had captured my imagination as a little boy. Looking back, I don't really see a drawing anymore. I see evidence. Evidence that one extraordinary story captured the imagination of a little boy one ordinary afternoon. Evidence that my parents encouraged curiosity instead of dismissing it. Evidence that one book, one television movie, one drawing can quietly change the course of a life. That's the real provenance of this object. Not where it was made, not what it's worth, but what it set in motion. In the coming weeks, we'll open more case files, and I hope you'll join me. Sometimes it will begin with a famous artifact, sometimes with something almost forgotten. A book, a recipe, a chronometer, a piece of coal. Whatever the object, we'll follow the evidence wherever it leads. Because history doesn't owe us the story we want. It owes us the story that the evidence can support. I'm Damon Hendricks. Thank you for joining me for Case File 001, Drawn to Titanic. Next time on the Titanic Provenance Files, we open Case File 002, Walter Lord's A Night to Remember, the book that introduced generations of readers to Titanic and helped shape the way the world remembers her. I'll be joined by Titanic historian Don Lynch, who knew Walter Lord personally, to examine how survivor testimony became narrative and how that narrative becomes history. Until then, follow the history.